Right, so I'm going to be speaking today about needs and aspirations. And mostly I'll be talking about this in the context of human development, by which I mean the effort to support the social economic growth of people everywhere in the world, but especially those in low income communities. But I think many of the things I will say apply to many other contexts. And in fact, I try to apply them in my own life, in my interactions with other people, and of course with myself as well. So I'm going to start with a question for everybody. This slide is meant for people who are in an American audience, but you might have to make a bit of an adjustment for where you are. So I want you to imagine that somebody, let's say, gave you 10,000 US dollars, or if you're not in the United States, the equivalent of a month's salary for somebody who might be considered upper middle class, reasonably wealthy, but not super wealthy in your country. And you have this money, someone gave it to you, it's effectively free for you. Which of the following would you spend it on? A, tuition for a graduate degree, B, an executive coach, or C, a nice vacation. Now, I can't see who's raising their hands for which of these, but in many other audiences, I will say that a lot of people choose a nice vacation. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Certainly, if I had a little bit of extra cash, I would probably spend it on something that is, fun for me, and not necessarily some of these other things. Now, interestingly, when we approach groups that are particularly lower income and try to understand how they might spend their money and see what their needs are, we often assume that those needs are associated with things like nutrition, healthcare, education, the ability to earn more income, and so on. And a lot of the times, the people who seem to have a great need for income we're often puzzled when they spend things on things that we might consider frivolous, like mobile phone ringtones, or new apps on their phone, or as you can see in this photograph, having certain kind of photographs taken for weddings or other events, which turn out to cost quite a bit of money to have them done professionally. But I would argue that, if somebody who is immensely wealthy, like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos these days, were to look at people like me and probably many of you, that they might say, oh, these people, they could be earning so much more and they could be doing much better in their profession. Why would they waste their money on a vacation when they should be spending it on getting another degree or hiring an executive coach for themselves? And one of the things that I think we have a tendency to do is always focus on people's needs and trying to figure out how to address them, rather than finding other ways to understand what people actually want. And I want to talk a little bit more about needs and tell you a few stories that I've encountered. So this is a man whose name was A.V.M. Sani. I met him over a decade ago. He, at the time, I was visiting an organization that he had helped found in Jhansi in the middle of India. And he took me around to show me some of the projects that this organization was involved in the local community. And he was particularly proud that he was able to help these communities build something called a check dam, which is a kind of dam that is built along the river that only slows the flow of water. And what it does is that it then infuses the local land with water, so that he was able to get these farming communities to go from having just one harvest each year to 2 harvests a year, effectively doubling their income in a single stroke. And so, he was very happy about it. These are communities that are extremely poor. Most of them survive on less than $1 a day of consumption. And effectively, he was able to get them over the $1 a day benchmark. And then he thought, if they just altered their planting cycle a little bit, they could probably even get in 3 cycles of planting and harvesting every year. And so he could triple their income. And so he started suggesting to the villagers that they do that. And then interestingly, the villagers started complaining. They said, who is this old man trying to make us do more work when we just suddenly became much wealthier than we have ever been? Right? And so even though they are what we would consider extremely poor, they thought they had plenty of income already, and they didn't really want an outsider coming in to meddle with what he perceived to be a need. Relevant to our time, there's a question of whether modern medicine is a need. And of course, everywhere in the world, I would say, I personally feel we should provide as many vaccinations against COVID as we possibly could. And this is, again, an example from India, where a woman is getting vaccinated. And you can see from the background that she too is from a very rural area, likely relatively poor compared to all of us. But interestingly, in some places in the world, there are people who refuse to get vaccinated, including in the United States, in the very wealthy United States. And their basis is that they don't believe that vaccines should be required and that it should be a personal choice. And so they're suggesting that even more than public health, that the ability to make choices individually and to have that freedom is much more important. So again, something that one person considers to be a need is not necessarily considered as critical for other groups. And since I just mentioned freedom, I want to consider another option. So again, in many contexts, people value their political freedom, their ability to do pretty much as they want, as long as they're not harming others. In different parts of the world, there are still forms of slavery, effectively, in which people are indebted to somebody, and the way that they work off their debt is by basically providing labor to that person or family. And there's a very interesting story that was relayed by a man named Kevin Bales, who studies slavery and is active in trying to eliminate slavery in all of its kinds around the world. And he was talking at one point to a couple who had come into an inheritance. They, gained a lot of money from a relative who died, and as a result, were able to buy themselves out of their indentured servitude. But then within several weeks, you can see the quote that they said, "After my wife received this money, we paid off our debt and were free to do whatever we wanted. But I was worried all the time. What if one of the children got sick? What if our crop failed? What if the government wanted some money? Since we no longer belonged to the landlord, we didn't get food every day as before. Finally, I went to the landlord and asked him to take me back. I didn't have to borrow any money, but he agreed to let me be his halaha again. Now I don't worry so much, I know what to do." So this is an extreme example where somebody effectively gave up their freedom because they were far more concerned about their ability to provide food and basic needs for their family. So all of these are different kinds of needs, and the main point I want to make is that what people consider a need often changes based on the context, and that what one person considers a need is not always a need for another. And then in addition to that, that we often misjudge what real needs are for other people. And so what I want to point out is that despite all of these situations and the challenge of pursuing needs, that in a lot of work around human development, needs figure very prominently as the main thing that people believe they are trying to address. In multiple social sciences, needs are emphasized as something that we should be attending to. In 1976, the International Labor Organization, which is a United Nations organization, highlighted the importance of everybody being able to fulfill their basic needs, and that should be one of the goals of employment. And then in educational technology, there was this idea called a needs assessment, where you go into a community that you're trying to help in some way and try to understand what their needs are as the first step in figuring out what you should do to support that community. And this idea has gone well beyond educational technology at this point, and you'll hear it in many contexts in which people are interested in human development. Meanwhile, there are other disciplines like design and in technology where people talk about needs as well. So this is from Don Norman, who is a very well-known designer and somebody who thinks a lot about design. And he says, good design puts human needs, capabilities, and behaviors first, and then designs to accommodate those needs. We have to accept human behavior the way it is, not the way we wish it would be. And so this is a sensibility from the field of design, which has, I would say, a lot of influence through technology and through other industries, basically saying we shouldn't try to change people, but instead we should understand their needs and then try to accommodate them, try to address those needs exactly as they exist. Now, incidentally, needs as they're defined in the dictionary are often like this. So a need is a necessity or requirement. And another definition here is violence, force, constraint, or compulsion exercised upon a person. And you can see, especially with the second definition, how much it's about constraints. And it comes, these words are all very negative words. These are not the kinds of words that you would, like to have people motivated by. And so I suggest that there are lots of different negatives associated with this idea of addressing people's needs. Needs themselves are often motivated by negative feelings or events. They're usually very intensely felt, but often temporary. So for example, hunger is a real need, but once it's met, it goes away, and you don't keep worrying about being hungry as soon as you've had some food. Needs are also not always acted upon, and in different social sciences, they understand that there's a difference between what people express as a need and what they actually act on as a need. They're also often very easy to project onto by people outside of a community. So as I was showing you in the earlier slides, people with our level of wealth and so on often feel that anybody who is much poorer than us must have additional income as a severe need. And then the other thing about needs is because they're so immediate and so apparently dire, they elicit charity as a solution. And by charity, I mean they elicit giving as a solution, right? For example, if I see a poor child who appears hungry, my immediate instinct is to want to provide the food right then and there and provide money. Now, one question is, given that needs often are connected to so many negative emotions and so on, are there other ways that we can focus on what we want to achieve in human development? And I ultimately go back to this phrase in English that's called needs and aspirations. So apparently this is a phrase that that was very common in the 1800s in English-speaking countries. And it refers to this idea that there's a range of desires that people have. Because you have to say needs and aspirations, it occurred to me that aspirations must be something very different from needs, even though they're another kind of desire. And in fact, in the usage in English, this is a graph from Google Ngrams, and it basically shows the frequency of word usage in various books over over 2 centuries in this case. And you can see that needs were increasingly talked about over the last century, and they have they still are used quite frequently as a word compared to aspirations, which exist and are mentioned occasionally, but very rarely. And so what I would like to do for the remainder of this talk is talk about aspirations and try to understand them a little bit. So I am an academic. I'm a professor at a university, and my first inclination whenever I want to understand a concept is to go to existing literature. And it turns out that there are many, many different fields that have thought about aspirations and how and what they exactly are. But overall, they're not necessarily the sense of aspiration that I think of when I normally use the word, and they're not the ones that I think are appropriate for what I'm talking about. Some fields talk about aspirations being about a career. So, we say things like somebody has an aspiration to be a doctor or to become an engineer. Sometimes they're about specific levels of accomplishment. So they might be an aspiration, let's say, to graduate from university or to become a marathon runner or something like that. And sometimes they have to do with consumption. So there's a phrase in English called aspirational consumption, which usually suggests that people are buying things as a way to indicate the kind of social status that they would like to have. All of these definitions ultimately for me were a little bit unsatisfactory. And so I went back to dictionaries to kind of understand the normal use of the word, the vernacular use of the word. And so these are 3 different dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary, Merriam-Webster, and Wiktionary, all English dictionaries. And you can see the definitions of aspiration here. And if you look at them, they have multiple things in common. So first of all, they all define an aspiration as a kind of desire. Secondly, they suggest that the desire is strong and persistent. And I particularly want to pull out the fact that they tend to be persistent. And then finally, aspirations tend to aim for something higher. And you can see even the dictionaries are not quite sure how to define this. So in one it says a desire for something above one, to achieve something high or great, to achieve something that is elevated or spiritual. And these are very vague terms, but you get the idea that they're about trying to achieve something positive. So for example, an aspiration, usually wouldn't be to do something negative, right? Like you don't have an aspiration to harm somebody else. You don't have an aspiration to destroy something that somebody has built. So the definition of aspiration that I would like to propose that we think about is that an aspiration is a type of desire that is persistent and aiming for something higher. And I want to be very clear that, at least for the purposes of the way I use this word, if it's neither persistent nor aiming for something higher, it is by definition not an aspiration. So let's look at how aspirations and needs are different. Needs, of course, are another kind of desire, right? When you're hungry or thirsty or want to earn more money, those are all desires. But they're often motivated by negative feelings, right? They're motivated by fear, by, again, hunger and thirst. They're motivated by things that we don't want, and therefore we want something else. Whereas aspirations are aimed at something positive and better. Needs are fleeting. They last for as long as you experience the need, but as soon as it's satisfied, they often go away. Whereas aspirations are things that we often carry forward over a long expanse of time. Needs are easy to project from the outside. It's easy to assume that we understand people's needs just from understanding their external life circumstances. But aspirations are really about what we desire and what we imagine for ourselves, and they're, I think, a little bit harder to project onto other people, though certainly they can also be projected. The second suggestion I want to make, and this is really more for people who are, might be inclined to think of this in a scholarly way, is that aspirations can be operationalized. And by that, I mean that they can be used as the basis for doing research, and to some extent, they can be probably measured. Several years ago, when I started thinking about how to think about aspirations, I wanted to see, whether there was a way to talk about them that would work in most languages, such that we could elicit what people's aspirations were. And this is kind of the phrasing that I came up with. So among those things which you have some control over, what would you most like to change about yourself or your life over the next 5 years? And the idea with the 5 years is that it's a long enough time frame that people are thinking about things that carry over time. And the idea with having some control over them was that I didn't want people to think about things like winning the lottery, which some people might have as a desire, but which is not really anything that you can ultimately control. I had a sample survey company in Kenya insert this in one of their surveys that they conduct nationwide. And so they reached 2,000 people, only about 1,800 were actually answered these questions, but I think it was still quite a good sample. And here are some of the sample responses. So in answer to this question at the top, the responses were things like, I want to advance my education so that I can earn a well-paying job. I want to live in a better place. I want to start a business. I want to have children and provide for them. I want to do more community service. And together with a research assistant, we categorized every one of these 1,800 responses into smaller categories. And most of them fell into, in fact, all of them fell into one of these 7 categories. They were about increasing income, owning a business, improving their standard of living, obtaining more education, growing or strengthening family, serving others or serving God, or improving oneself. And again, I think you can see that these are exactly what you might expect from aspirations. These are persistent, and they look like they're aiming for something above whatever people feel that they are now. And I want to stress again that again, this is a sample survey. There might very well have been people who were criminal in their actual lives, but their aspirations, again, aligned with very positive goals. And then finally, the claim that I want to make is that aspirations are better than needs as a way to think about how to change the world and how to help communities thrive, and also in our own personal lives, how to engage with other people. Aspirations are focused on optimistic emotions. They're often longer term. And one of the challenges, I think, with any kind of attempt to change the world is that it's very difficult to change even one person. And I say that even for myself, trying to change who I am is requires an incredible act of will, just to change little things about myself. And so if you're really trying to change larger issues around the world, we need something that is motivating us on an ongoing, persistent basis. Again, that's one reason why I think aspirations serve that purpose, whereas needs, because they're so temporary, can be so easily satisfied, are not as effective for social change. I think aspirations also inspire a response that is more about providing mentorship and support, but not outright charity necessarily. And then also there's something interesting about aspirations, which I'll get into a little bit towards the end of this talk, which is that I think they're applicable just as much for rich and powerful people as they are for poor and marginalized groups. And so it's arguably a kind of gradient that works for everybody. In fact, we can all be partners in trying to help each other achieve each other's aspirations, whereas with needs, it's very easy to imagine that wealthy, powerful people have all their needs met, and therefore they don't need to do anything else. And I think that's exactly the wrong thing. We need rich and powerful people to also be supported in achieving their own aspirations. Again, the positive ones. So some caveats and clarifications. I don't believe that aspiration-focused efforts necessarily solve everything. There's certainly many instances in which needs still need to be addressed. But I do think that an aspirational focus is actually superior to a needs focus from a larger kind of broader perspective in trying to cause a positive change in the world. And that my main claim at this point, certainly not a fact, but opinion, is that aspirations are better than needs as a primary focus in human development. And before I go through some examples of how this might actually work in practice, I'll just mention that I do think there's lots of issues that still need to be worked out. Again, I'm a researcher, and so I often think about what are all of the kind of conceptual issues that need to be addressed before we can really implement aspirations. And I have some listed here. I'm not going to go into them in detail. So going back to human development, I want to turn to some stories where I think very effective ways to affect change have happened through utilizing aspiration in some way. Many of these stories are taken incidentally from India. That's a country where I often do a lot of my work. In this cartoon, you're seeing an illustration of an interesting program that was run in North India, I think in Haryana, that was called No Toilet, No Bride. And what this campaign was trying to do, as a baseline, let me just mention that in many parts of India, especially in rural regions, the use of toilets is not yet common. In fact, many families routinely go to the bathroom in specified areas outdoors, and they are actually resistant to having a toilet inside the house because they think that's disgusting, which it makes a certain kind of sense, right? I mean, why would you want to do this business inside your house when you have the great outdoors to do it in? But there's a number of reasons, for sanitary reasons, why toilets still make sense from a modern perspective. And so there are campaigns to try to get more toilets to be used. This particular campaign was trying to rely on an aspirational way of framing this so that people would actually take this up. And by the way, again, I'll also say that the history of international development in India with respect to sanitation is such that lots of people have tried to get people to use toilets, and they have all generally failed. And this is one of the few successful campaigns. So the main thing about this campaign was that they ran these ads on the radio, on television, and so on, where they often would hire reasonably well-known actors and actresses, engaged in a situation where they would talk about the fact that, they had a toilet in their home, and that any woman, any self-respecting woman or their families should not expect to marry their daughters into a family that didn't have a toilet in their home. And they made this about social class, right? That anybody who was middle class and richer had toilets in their home. So why would you want to go to a house that didn't have that kind of status? And because it hooked into this aspiration, for both wealth and social status, there were studies that show that that the percentage of toilets in homes increased by 11%, which is stunning based on previous attempts to install toilets in various homes. And what I want to point out is that this campaign hooked into people's aspirations, right? It didn't say toilets are good for you. It didn't say toilets are a need for your health. It said, if you want to aim for the kind of lifestyle that you want, one thing you should do is have a toilet in your home. And I think, and that's one reason why I believe it was successful. I want to tell you another story. This one was actually related to research that one of my colleagues conducted. So I used to live and work in India, in Bangalore, and we were a computer science research lab, and we had many of the employees of this research lab, of course, were working class people who did things like worked on security, they cleaned the building and so on and so forth. And as a experiment, we provided them with a internet connected computer that they could use at any point that during their breaks when they weren't otherwise working. And this was based on another project by another Indian educator who had put these computers into rural communities and suggested that kids would start playing with the computers on their own and learn English and things like that. Those claims turned out not to be true, but we thought maybe with adults, they would find interesting uses for these computers. And again, speaking in sense of needs, we thought, this is a community that is, relatively less educated. Maybe they would find ways to teach themselves. And what we found was, for the most part, they used the computers for entertainment, and they watched movies, they listened to music and things like that. There was very little of anything that we defined to be productive. However, there was one exception, which was this gentleman that's shown in this figure. And it turned out that he was taking courses in data entry outside in his free time. And then he would use the computer that we provided as a way to practice. And within a few months after we started this project, he was able to get a job as a data entry professional. And for him, it was a dramatic jump in kind of socioeconomic class. Even though it meant he had to take a cut in earnings, that job, unlike that of a security guard, meant that in the future he could earn quite a bit more than what he was earning today. And he was so proud of this. He was overjoyed. He came to tell us the day that he got this job, and he said, "Today I can stand up in front of my father and friends and say that I'm no more a watchman, but I'm doing a computer job." And again, I think you can see that, that he made productive use of this computer that we provided because of this aspiration to do a different kind of job altogether. And we changed our program a little bit after this to think of it more in terms of helping people think in terms of whatever aspirations they might have in their life and their career, rather than thinking of the computer itself as necessarily the site of education and learning. One more example. So an economist by the name of Rob Jensen conducted this study. This is very interesting. So again, in India, in many rural communities, families are reluctant to invest in their girl children because they often believe that girls will end up just becoming married and they won't be working and they won't end up providing any kind of financial support back to the family. And many of these families are extremely poor. There's nothing like social security. And so as a result, they often have to rely on the next generation to support the parents. So in this particular study, what Rob Jensen did was to hire recruiters who were looking for potential employees that would work in the city as data entry professionals, as customer support professionals, but they needed people who had a certain level of education. They needed all the people that they were looking for to at least have a 12th grade education. But what Jensen did was to convince these recruiters to randomly go to different villages and look for girls that were qualified. And he found qualified women. And so he was able to hire from each village 2 women to this particular thing. And because this was a job in the city, it was associated with white collar work, they immediately earned a lot more money than anybody working in these rural communities. So the interesting part is this. This was run as a controlled, randomized control study. So there were some villages in which the recruiter did not go and therefore did not hire any women. And there were some villages in which they hired 2 women from each village. And within a couple of years, what Jensen found was that in the villages where the women were recruited, girl children were fed more and they were more likely to be in school. And the idea is that, as news got around that these two women from a particular village were able to be employed in white-collar job outside the city and earning, very good salaries, the parents in those communities realized, hey, if we invest in the education and the health of our girl children, they can do just as well as our boy children. And so effectively the study hooked into the aspiration of the parents to want a secure financial future and was able to change the way that they treated their girls. And again, the messaging had nothing to do with, oh, you need to invest in the girls because it's good for the girls. It's not about, necessarily gender equality. It's not about anything being good for you. It's more about just, hooking into the existing aspirations that people have. Say that there can be very powerful cause positive socioeconomic change if we can find the right aspirational levers to use, and if programs can be cast in a way that is more about rather than the need that we perceive as outsiders that needs to be addressed. For our, academics, I will say that the concept of aspirations, I think, links to many existing ideas, as well as in some other social science fields. I won't cover these in much detail, but I do want to mention that I think that individual aspirations are also very powerfully connected to what happens at the societal level. And here I'm going to borrow concepts from several different scholars. The first one is Abraham Maslow, who was a psychologist who theorized that there was a hierarchy of needs that many of you will probably have heard about. And basically, his theory was that all human beings have the same set of needs, but depending on the person and depending on the context, different needs are primary. So for example, most of us, when we're extremely hungry, like if we haven't eaten for a day or two, we'll find that the desire to fulfill the need for food is much greater motivator than, let's say, finishing our homework or getting a particular project done on time. And so will outweigh the desire to work. On the other hand, there are also people who go on hunger strikes, right? They are willing to suffer a deal of physiological pain in order to achieve some higher goal. And the way Maslow thought about that is there are some people who have a very strong motivation for self-transcendence and for trying to help contribute to their communities. And because that need was so strong in them, that they could actually overcome some of the prior needs. And what I want to do is flip those around and think of them less as a hierarchy of needs and more as a hierarchy of aspirations. That is, many of us have a kind of baseline aspiration, which is somewhere on, on this hierarchy. Those of us who might have led a life having enough to eat or enough income to be able to satisfy our basic needs will often aspire to careers where that is the most important aspect. Whereas those of us who might have grown up in an environment in which we didn't have to worry about money so much are often, we have the privilege of being able to aspire to careers where we get to do what we want and express who we are rather than necessarily worrying about income. And what I think is interesting is that there are a range of things that go beyond individuals that also appear to have some kind of hierarchical thing, and that they're all possibly even linked. In other words, if a large number of people in a particular group have a strong aspiration, let's say for self-transcendence and trying to do things for other people, that as a society will act very differently from a group that is, let's say, driven primarily by the need to ensure that they have a secure livelihood. And there's some evidence that this kind of change happens very slowly over time. Over on the left is a graph from Richard Florida, who studies what he calls the creative class. But what I want to show in this graph is that in the United States, you can see that different types of professions have dominated in terms of the percentage of people who are working in them. So the green line shows farming, fishing, and forestry. And you can see from the 1900s that this was in decline over time, but the decline coincided with a large amount of working class people who often worked in factories. You know, they were arguably generating an incredible amount of the economic capacity of the United States. And then you can see that in these lines called the service and creative, that over time we have seen a larger percentage of the population working in industries that have less to do with making material things and more about providing services and providing creative things such as music or movies or books and so on and so forth. And what this suggests is that over time, you know, there's been shifts in the country in terms of the kind of work that people do. And I would argue that it also probably corresponds to shifts in, you know, individuals' ability to take care of their basic physiological needs and then eventually their economic needs, and ultimately now more of our kind of self-actualizing needs and desire to do the work that we care about. On the right is a graph from a researcher named by the name of Ron Engelhardt, who is a political scientist. And what he has found, what he's been doing over the last several decades is run a global survey called the World Value Survey, where in various countries, people conduct a very lengthy survey about various things having to do with their own economic situation, how they feel about different things, how they feel about religion, and so on and so forth. And one of the conclusions of his work is that when a country reaches a certain amount of economic capacity, people's values shift away from values that tend to emphasize the need for structure and hierarchy and material goods towards ones that are more self-expressive. Like they begin to value more things like political freedom, the ability to do the kind of work that you want, and so on and so forth. And this is something that he has seen across, you know, many countries and happening over time. So what I want to suggest is that in some way, by understanding, you know, our own personal motivations and how different things can affect our own aspirations, we can understand the way that, you know, society also changes, and that, you know, we have to expect that in order to change society in a deep way, that we also have to address individual aspirations and ensure that people can meet the aspirations that they have, so that they can, you know, so they have the kind of psychological slack to address other aspirations. And then finally, I just want to mention that, you know, again, in a certain you know, socioeconomic class, especially in the United States, this is the idea to follow your aspirations is a message that we convey to, you know, almost everybody. I went through a bunch of commencement addresses that were given by famous people, and most of these commencement speeches can fall into two categories. One is about how you know, we should all contribute to serving our communities and our societies, and the other is about following your dreams and following your aspirations. And what's interesting to me is that, you know, this is the advice that we give to our children. You know, we want our children to follow their dreams and their aspirations, and yet somehow when we talk about other people's children, we're more concerned with you know, their immediate needs rather than thinking about how we might be able to expand their capacity to think about their own futures. So with that, I'm going to finish. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Kentaro. I think, folks, again, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat window, and we'll pick it up as we go along. Just to start some conversation, Kentaro, you know, one of the things that is sort of becoming a hype these days is researches around universal basic income as sort of a new form of trying to think about work, meeting the needs, aspirations, and so on. What are your current thoughts on how human society or civic society might actually respond to UBI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, you know, I would say there's two things that I would say about that with respect to aspirations. One is, I think something like that would be a terrific thing in that it immediately relieves the need for people to struggle to have their basic needs met. And so I think it instantly, would raise, anybody who feels like they're not able to meet those needs to a level where that consideration no longer becomes the driving, consideration in their lives. And I think it would help raise a generation of children who would grow up to not have to think in terms of, my most important thing is making sure that I can earn a living, which at least I would say is that was an unfortunate way to have to live life. On the other hand, I think in and of itself, it doesn't address some of these other aspirations. I think as soon as that need is met, what we'll find is people have other aspirations. They want to accomplish things. They want to do things that they believe in. And for many of us who have our material needs and our emotional needs met, I think the top aspiration is how do we contribute to the rest of society so that we can help those who are less fortunate than ourselves? How can we ensure that everybody is has their their physical, emotional, economic needs met and is actually helping to contribute to a better society? And I think in and of itself, basic income is terrific at addressing the lowest level of needs and therefore bumping everybody's aspiration up a little bit. But I don't think it in any way solves the challenge of how do we get people who are very comfortable with their material needs to think more and aspire more to how they can contribute to society overall.
I think that is one of the challenges when we speak about ethical framing and transformative values of things. That when you were showing the chart of Maslow's hierarchy and talking about people achieving a certain amount of wealth to at least overcome whatever their perceived or actual needs might be. But there's no sure pipeline, there's no sort of sure ladder to presume that society at large would actually start to look at self-actualization and self-transcendence once they become wealthy. You take a large sort of social experiment in some ways that one of the most incredible things that mainland China has done in the last 2 decades is brought about 500 million people out of poverty, right? Can we truly suggest that there is a correlation or causation around the freedom, the expression that you were mentioning, or creativity, curiosity, and if we were to use Maslow's terminology of self-actualization and self-transcendence?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So one thing I would say first is that sometimes people confuse self-actualization and self-transcendence, and Maslow himself actually did not separate those two at the beginning. In fact, if you look at his earlier kind of hierarchies, he thought self-actualization was the top, and he often included a lot of self-transcendent ideas among people he considered self-actualized. But later in his career, he began to feel that they were actually two distinct things, and that they should be treated differently. And that's why in my diagram, I have self-transcendence as a separate layer. I feel, at least I feel this at a very personal level, like, I'm extremely comfortable at a material level. Like, I have no real material needs from day to day that I can't cover. And emotionally, I'm pretty satisfied, right? And internally, I have this aspiration to be a better person who is able to contribute more to, the community around me, as well as to, the communities that I don't necessarily live among. But I don't think that I'm doing as much as I could, right? And so there's a great question for me, which is how do I get myself to, to put in more energy towards this aspiration that is very visible to me? And I think that that is one of the great, research questions that I think we should all be pursuing, which is, how can we live in a country like, let's say, the United States, where many of us are in a similar situation as me? We're extremely comfortable, and yet, our day-to-day energy is spent, watching Netflix or, doing our job in a very, in a very kind of coasting way, and not thinking more about how we can contribute. I'm always super inspired by people who, have, I would say, who are realizing the aspiration that I have for myself, but without the same level of like what appears to me as, material satisfaction, right? So, why is that? And then, on the flip side, there are people like, you could think about people like, I don't know, Larry Ellison or, Jeff Bezos, who certainly have way more material wealth. I mean, it seems very clear that they could be doing a lot more. How can we awaken the aspiration to be more self-transcendent in them? And I think that's a very, big question. I know, Tenzin, that you are personally, I think, working on some version of these things, even if you don't use the same words. And yeah, I think, from a research standpoint, I think we know a lot about what we need to do. And in many areas, there's not more research that needs to be done. But I do think in this area, we just have no idea. How do we convince people whose personal needs are all taken care of to let go of having to keep chasing more of that, so that they can attend to more self-transcendent aspirations.
No, I think that's one of the sort of individual dilemmas that we see come up often, that we create this contrast between abundance and scarcity, and operating out of a mind of abundance versus mindset of scarcity. But we actually see that even when individuals have their needs met, physiological, some psychological, even if it's not in its entirety, the fear of scarcity lingers, which sort of poses enormous kind of obstacles in lives of individuals to get to self-actualization or self-transcendence in order to actually create a better world. So before I take other questions, one question further, given your own experience, working with folks like Bill Gates and Microsoft and so on, I mean, historically, we have seen that we have thrown tremendous amount of funding and money trying to solve the poverty challenge or poverty issue. I don't think we can say we have done very well globally on that front, and we can say that disease and hunger, it just keeps rising, and we can point to certain different causes and so on. But there's a tremendous amount of wealth today that we see. What would your advice be to philanthropists such as these, who at best I see hired 3,000 people to manage their money and philanthropy, creating another bureaucratic system that is probably more tenuous than the government bureaucratic system? What would your advice or suggestion be for individuals who have the means and aspirations to become philanthropists to create a better world? What should they be paying attention to?
That's a great question. I certainly don't have a good answer for this. It's something I have given a lot of thought to. One thing I think I will first say is that I think we, as a society, I think we need to be reasonably encouraging of people who have made steps in that direction, even though they're often really easy to criticize for many reasons. So, I think Bill Gates is a perfect example of somebody who, you can visibly see a shift in his adult career from somebody who was very focused on entrepreneurship and accomplishment and, and money, to somebody who who decided, hey, I need to find a way to make a more positive contribution. And, I don't think that he has made that shift completely, but I think that shift is visible in his career, and it's the kind of thing that we want to encourage more of. And certainly not every, I think he's somewhat self-conscious of that as well, which is why he and, Warren Buffett have this, I don't know what the club is called, but they're trying to convince other billionaires to, commit to spending half of their wealth on positive causes and things like that. I think a lot of it in his case is that more than anything, I think a lot of philanthropists come in with they're supremely confident people because they've been so confident, they've been so successful in some arena, and they have very little intuitive understanding of what most of the rest of the world experiences, and so they have no idea how difficult it is to change certain things. If the one thing I would really like to see Bill Gates do is go spend a year in a very poor village somewhere where he would like to see more development, and alone with some amount of resources, but not his billions of dollars, try to see if he can cause the change that he would like to see in those communities just by interacting with the people there, and see what comes from that. I mean, I think he would learn a tremendous amount in that process, and I think it would fundamentally, and I think he would also gain a lot of empathy for, the people he already has a lot of intellectual empathy for, but not necessarily, emotional empathy for. And I think that would, change the way he thinks about how development should and could be done.
Thank you. We have a question from Mana. How do you avoid letting your own biases, opinions influence your approach to helping people achieve their aspirations? Alternatively, is it okay to influence other people's aspirations?
So first of all, I think in any kind of engagement, it's impossible that you will be free of your own biases, and that to some extent they will creep in. And I think that's one reason why and engaging in any kind of work like this, we as individuals have to do a lot of introspection and reflection and meditation, whatever it takes for us to know ourselves, so that we don't insert too much of our egotistical desires into that equation. I think that's very important. And then number two, with respect to aspirations, I mean, one thing that I find is, even after, thinking about this way of thinking about human development, I find that even then, out of habit, I have a tendency to want to understand people's needs and what seems to be dire issues for people, rather than just asking them straight out, what do you want to change about your life? What is it that you most want to see? And I think just repeatedly asking that question is in some ways a very important element, because it ensures that you're listening to the other person rather than, imposing what you conceive of as would be good for them. I do think that in some cases it's important to think about, how you might affect somebody's aspirations, but there too, it's really, really important to kind of do it with a clear sense of where, your own motivations are coming from. Sometimes even when you think you have a positive motivation, it is hiding behind layers of, very egotistical motivations that I think are very hard to see through. And so it's difficult, but I think worth trying.
I think, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and we have had some previous conversations on it, is the tech world that's trying to make the world better. We have entered into an era where there's a tremendous amount of virtue signaling, storytelling, and narratives. You mentioned a couple of projects like, putting a computer in slums and giving them internet access, and whether it actually leads to learning or whether it leads to just further sort of binging on Netflix and other things. And there's a lot of noise that is created by supposed success of technological interventions in order to make people's life better. How would you advise for individuals to bypass this amount of virtue signaling or storytelling, even if the intention is good? See, as we have some Russian friends here, and there's a proverb in Russian language, I believe, which is, "The roads to hell are paved with good intentions."
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to be honest with you, Tenzin, I feel like you would have a much better answer to this than I would. But from what I see, I think it is without doubt that virtue signaling or recognition for you doing good work is, I think, one of the most insidious elements of working with other people, where you're helping others. I mean, I certainly see it in myself. By doing this kind of work, I get a lot of personal value in my own life through recognition, through grants, through being able to publish papers, and it's I mean, unless I literally quit my job and do things in a do something, approach these projects in a very different way, I can't get away from it. But the one thing I am conscious of is that, to the extent possible, I try not to seek out that thing that I know is inside of me, in terms of wanting people to necessarily see my role in these things. In fact, I think the most successful projects are those where the people who supposedly are quote unquote being helped in some way are actually the ones who become most visible in the project. And I think the ones where there's a hero figure somewhere that becomes very well known are often by definition driven by something else. And so, it's quite rare, but oftentimes there are occasional projects where the community itself becomes well known and becomes famous for being able to, help themselves. And I think, anybody who's affiliated with helping those communities has succeeded in keeping themselves out of the picture and really supporting the community.
One of the, perhaps maybe the last question for us for this session, one of the arguments that a lot of times philanthropic or other organizations, for good or bad reasons, make is about the ability for certain interventions to scale up, right? And again, there may be overlapping symptoms of needs of communities, or as you have tried to differentiate, that the aspirations might be overlapping and so on. But what do you think of this movement where pretty much every grant making organization in this kind of space tries to suggest, well, what's your plan for scaling this up? What's your plan for scaling this up and in a very fast manner? I mean, I look at the questions sometimes and I'm like, these people would not have ever funded somebody like Mother Teresa or St. Francis of Assisi. Like people we actually admire for doing this kind of work, or a Baba Amte in India who worked with the lepers. Being in the trenches that you have been, and given your experience with the research and a variety of interventions and so on, what are your current thoughts on this idea of scaling?
Yeah, scale is seductive because, if we had a choice, all of us want to have an impact on 100 people rather than 10 people, and 1 million people rather than 100, right? And it looks like the right thing to do, but I think it's also very easy to have one's, again, ego invested in scale, right? Like I can tell you pretty much straight out that, a lot of philanthropic foundations, they will just tell you directly that, they want to be known for having solved some problem at scale, and therefore anything that doesn't achieve that scale is not worth their consideration. And I think that's just pure ego. It's like, I mean, what else is it? Like if your foundation wants to be known for that purpose, then obviously you're not holding the beneficiaries in mind primarily, you're holding yourself in mind primarily. And I think that's the danger of scale. As a practical matter, I just think that scale is certainly important for some people to think about, and I would say primarily policymakers, of governments. But everybody else, if we all each had a positive impact on 10 people, that would be enough, right? If everybody did it. And so I do think that scale is overemphasized, and it often ends up, resulting in programs where, a tiny bit of difference that almost doesn't help anybody is spread across millions of people rather than causing really meaningful impact on individuals. This is, to be honest with you, it's a lesson that I'm also trying to really digest myself. But in my life, I've come to the recognition that the best things that I'm doing are actually not those projects that are trying to have reasonably broad impact. They're the ones that they're in the interactions that I have with my students. They're in the interactions that I have one-on-one, and that's where I'm making the deepest kind of impact. And often the impact is also the conversely is coming to me also through those interactions. So I think scale is dangerous.
I like the idea of scale is seductive.
Yeah, it's dangerous. Seductive.
It's seductive. Kentaro, thank you so very much for joining us this morning, and you have given us a lot to ponder and to think about. And for those of you who are here, next Wednesday, we have a professor from MIT Department of Philosophy, Kiran Sethia, who will speak on the meaning of life. I'm sure several of you have asked this question, perhaps even more than once. I'm not sure if Kiran will give you answers, but hopefully it'll be a very reflective session, something that he has been thinking about more intensely. Thanks so much again, Kentaro,
Thank you so
and
much. It
look
was an
forward to seeing all of you next time. Thank you.